I never thought my life could fall apart so suddenly. But here I am, replaying that one night over and over like a bad movie I can't turn off. Let me start from the beginning, so maybe you can help me make sense of it all. Growing up wasn't easy. My stepdad Frank was tough as nails, ex-cop, strict as they come. At the time, I hated his rules, but looking back, maybe that's what kept me on the straight and narrow. He pushed me to do well in school, to aim higher than he ever could. History was my escape, and I threw myself into it. Books about wars, empires, and revolutions fascinated me. They made me believe I could build something bigger than myself. College was my big break. That's where I met Esther. She wasn't like anyone I'd ever known, sharp-witted, full of fire, and always ready with a challenge. She was in law school, and I admired how she could argue anyone under the table. Esther made everything feel alive. Our relationship wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and I thought that was enough. We got engaged 2 years ago, right after I landed a teaching position at a university. Life was looking good. But as our careers grew, so did the distance between us. Esther's firm demanded long hours, endless socializing, and keeping up appearances with colleagues who seemed more like sharks than humans. Meanwhile, I threw myself into teaching and research, sometimes too much, I'll admit. Somewhere in the chaos, we stopped really seeing each other. Then came New Year's Eve. Esther's firm was hosting this big party, and I didn't want to go. Crowded rooms and pretentious chatter aren't my scene. But she insisted. "It'll be good for us," she said. I wanted to believe her. The night was all champagne flutes and fake smiles. Esther was her usual charming self, working the room like she owned it. I stuck to the edge, sipping my drink, nodding politely when someone tried to talk to me about politics or real estate. At one point, I realized Esther was nowhere in sight. I figured she'd stepped out for air. Parties could be overwhelming for her, too. I wish I'd stayed in my corner. I wish I hadn't gone looking for her. Because when I found her, my world collapsed. Esther was in the library, tangled up with someone I recognized, a guy named James Moriarty. He worked at her firm, a smug, smooth-talking type who always seemed too interested in her. They didn't see me at first. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding like it was trying to escape. When Esther finally noticed me, her face twisted into something between shock and guilt. "John, wait, it's not what it looks like," she stammered, pulling away from James. I didn't say a word. I couldn't. My chest felt tight, like I was suffocating. James just smirked, the kind of look that says, "What are you gonna do about it?" That was the last straw. I turned and left without another word, not caring who saw me storming out. Esther caught up to me in the parking lot, her voice cracking as she called my name. I stopped, barely able to look at her. "How long?" I asked, my voice colder than I thought possible. "It wasn't John, it was a mistake," she said, tears streaming down her face. But I'd heard enough. I got in the car and drove away, leaving her standing there in her sparkling dress under the streetlights. That night was the end of us. At least, that's what I thought. The drive home felt like a blur. My hands were shaking on the wheel, my head pounding with questions I didn't want to ask but couldn't stop. How long had this been going on? Was it really just a mistake, or had it been happening under my nose for months? I couldn't wrap my mind around the fact that the woman I was going to marry could do this. When I got home, I sat in the dark for what felt like hours. I kept replaying the moment in my head, the way James smirked, the look on Esther's face. I wanted to smash something, to scream, to do anything to get rid of the anger and humiliation swirling inside me. Instead, I just sat there, staring at nothing. The next morning, Esther showed up at my apartment. I hadn't slept, and I didn't want to see her, but she kept knocking until I let her in. She looked terrible, hair a mess, makeup smudged, and eyes red from crying. For a split second, I almost felt sorry for her, but the image of her with James came rushing back, and my chest tightened with rage. "John, please, just let me explain," she started, her voice shaking. "There's nothing to explain," I said, crossing my arms. "I saw everything." "It wasn't what you think," she said, taking a step closer. It just happened. I wasn't thinking. Stop. I held up a hand, cutting her off. "Do you think I'm an idiot? That I'm just going to forget what I saw because you're sorry now?" Tears streamed down her face, but I didn't care. She kept talking, apologizing, blaming the stress of work, the long hours, and the distance between us. She said James had been persistent, that she didn't mean for anything to happen. But it did, Esther, I snapped. It happened. And now what? You expect me to just move on like it's nothing? No, she cried, reaching for me, but I stepped back. I don't expect that. I love you, John. I messed up, but I love you. Please don't throw everything away because of one mistake. Her words felt like knives. Love? She said she loved me, but how could she love me and still betray me like that? I shook my head, trying to keep my voice steady. Do you even know how this feels? To see the person you trust more than anyone in the world throw it all away for him. I couldn't even bring myself to say James's name. I know, she whispered. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that this was a one-time thing, a mistake we could somehow work through. But every time I looked at her, all I could see was her with James. It was like the memory was burned into my mind, and I didn't know how to make it go away. I need space, I said finally. I can't even think straight right now. John, please, she begged, but I shook my head. Just go, Esther, I said. Go. She hesitated, like she wanted to argue, but eventually, she turned and walked out the door. I didn't watch her leave. I just stood there, staring at the floor, wondering how the hell my life had come to this. For the next few days, I buried myself in work. I avoided calls from friends and family, ignored texts from Esther, and tried to pretend like everything was fine. But at night, when everything was quiet, the pain would hit me all over again. I felt like I was drowning, and I didn't know how to pull myself out. By the end of the week, the silence was unbearable. I'd been dodging calls and texts from Esther and a few mutual friends who'd probably heard some version of what happened. I wasn't ready to talk to anyone. Every time my phone buzzed, I half expected it to be her with another apology or excuse. Then it came, an email from an old colleague of Esther's. I hadn't spoken to this guy in over a year, so I was surprised to see his name in my inbox. The subject line just read, "Thought you should know." Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. His message was short but devastating. Hey John, I heard about what happened with Esther. I'm really sorry, man. I thought about reaching out sooner, but I didn't want to stir the pot. Just so you know, James has a reputation. He's done this before, flirting with coworkers, getting involved with women he shouldn't. I even heard rumors about him and Esther at last year's retreat. Don't let her tell you it was a one-time thing. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting into knots. A retreat? I remembered Esther going on that trip. She'd mentioned James being there, but she'd brushed it off like it was nothing. Had it started back then? Was I stupid for not seeing it? My head was spinning. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the guy was wrong. Maybe he was just stirring the pot, like he said. But deep down, I knew there was more to the story than Esther had let on that night. I gave in and called her. She answered on the second ring, her voice shaky like she'd been waiting for this moment. John, she said softly, I've been hoping you'd call. Don't get your hopes up, I replied, my tone sharp. I just need some answers. There was a pause. Okay, she said. Ask me anything. Did anything happen between you and James before New Year's? I asked, cutting straight to the point. What? No, she said quickly. Too quickly. Why would you even ask that? I got an email from someone you used to work with, I said, my voice cold. They said there were rumors about you and James at the retreat last year. Her silence was deafening. Who told you that? She asked finally, her voice defensive. Does it matter? I snapped. Just tell me the truth. I didn't do anything, she stammered. Yes, James flirted with me at the retreat, but I shut it down. I swear, John. You expect me to believe that? I said, anger bubbling up. After everything, you want me to believe you just happened to fall into his arms on New Year's? It wasn't like that, she cried. I was drunk, and he kissed me. I didn't stop it, but I didn't mean for it to happen. Her voice cracked, but I didn't feel an ounce of sympathy. So this wasn't the first time, I said bitterly. It started back then, didn't it? No, she insisted. John, please. It was a mistake. I love you. I never wanted to hurt you. Her words felt hollow. I could tell she was still holding something back, and I wasn't sure I could take any more half-truths. You know what, Esther? I'm done trying to get the truth out of you. If you can't even be honest now, after everything, then there's nothing left to say. John, wait, she started, but I hung up. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with all the lies she'd told, the pieces of the puzzle I hadn't put together before. If she was willing to admit to that much, what else was she hiding? Every memory I had of her felt tainted, like I couldn't trust anything anymore. For the first time, I started to wonder if I'd ever really known her at all. The morning after that call, I woke up to another buzz on my phone. This time, it was from Mark, one of my closest friends and someone who'd been in my corner for years. He'd heard about the breakup, of course. Word spreads fast in a small social circle, but he hadn't pressed me about it until now. Hey man. Just checking in. Heard some things I thought you should know, his text read. I sighed. At this point, I wasn't sure if I wanted to know more. But curiosity got the better of me. Call me, I texted back. Minutes later, Mark's name lit up my screen. I answered, and his voice was cautious, like he was choosing his words carefully. John, you okay? What do you think? I replied bitterly. What's going on, Mark? Look, I didn't want to say anything before because, well, I didn't have proof, and I didn't want to stir the pot, he started. My stomach churned. It felt like I'd heard this line before. But I've been to a few of those law firm events with Katie, and I've seen the way James acts around women. He's handsy. A little too friendly, if you know what I mean. Katie, Mark's wife, worked at the same firm as Esther, so Mark had been to more of those events than I ever had. What does that have to do with Esther? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Well, Mark hesitated, at the firm's summer gala, I noticed James paying a lot of attention to her. She didn't seem to shut it down. I thought maybe I was reading too much into it, but now, his voice trailed off. You're telling me you saw this months ago, and you didn't think to tell me? I snapped. I didn't know for sure, John, he defended himself. And you were so happy with her. I didn't want to plant doubts in your head if I was wrong. I gritted my teeth. Well, congratulations, Mark. You weren't wrong. He sighed. I'm sorry, man. I should have said something sooner. Save it, I interrupted. I've had enough people not wanting to stir the pot lately. After I hung up, I sat there, feeling the anger boil over. It wasn't just Esther anymore. It was everyone. Her colleagues who probably whispered behind my back, my friends who saw the warning signs and kept quiet, even Mark. I felt like a fool for trusting any of them. It didn't take long for another piece of the puzzle to fall into place. That afternoon, Katie called. She sounded nervous, like she was dreading the conversation. John, I don't know if Mark told you, but I wanted to talk about Esther. Go on, I said flatly, bracing myself. I didn't want to get involved, she started, echoing Mark's sentiment. But after the New Year's party, some of the women at the firm were talking. They've noticed James and Esther spending a lot of time together, even outside of work. What do you mean, outside of work? I asked, my pulse quickening. Well, there was a brunch a few weeks ago. Esther told me she was meeting up with some of the women from the office, but James was there too. They were close. My chest tightened. And you didn't think to tell me? John, I didn't want to jump to conclusions, she protested. I thought maybe it was innocent, and if it wasn't, I figured Esther would come clean. I let out a bitter laugh. Yeah, well, she didn't. By the end of the day, it felt like the walls were closing in. Everyone seemed to have known something, or suspected something, but no one had told me. I felt betrayed all over again, not just by Esther, but by the people I thought I could trust. I thought about texting Esther, demanding more answers, but what was the point? She'd only give me more half-truths, and I'd be left feeling worse than before. Instead, I turned off my phone, cracked open a bottle of whiskey, and sat on the couch, staring at the wall. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about one night or one mistake. It was a web of lies, spun over months, maybe longer. And I was the idiot who'd been caught in it. 2 days after Mark and Katie's bombshells, I couldn't take it anymore. The unanswered questions were eating me alive, and the anger I'd been trying to suppress was boiling over. I decided to confront Esther one last time, to rip off the bandage and get the truth, or whatever version of it she was willing to give me. I called her. She answered immediately, her voice cautious. John. We need to talk. In person, I said curtly. Okay, she agreed without hesitation. When? Tonight. My place. 8 o'clock. She showed up right on time, looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her hair was pulled back, her makeup minimal, and she was wearing one of those oversized sweaters she loved, a sweater I had given her, ironically enough. She stood in the doorway, hesitating, her eyes searching mine for some kind of clue about where this was going. I stepped aside, letting her in without a word. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the silence stretching uncomfortably. Finally, I broke it. "I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want the truth," I said, my voice firm. "No excuses. No half-truths. Just the truth." She nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Okay. Were you seeing James outside of work?" I asked, starting with the question that had been haunting me since Katie's call. Her face went pale. "John, Yes or no?" I interrupted. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it wasn't." "Don't," I cut her off, holding up a hand. "How many times?" "A few," she said, looking down at the table. "We grabbed coffee after meetings sometimes. There was the brunch Katie mentioned, and a couple of other times. But it wasn't like that, John. I wasn't cheating." "You weren't cheating?" I snapped, my voice rising. "You were spending time alone with him, lying to me about it, and you think that's not cheating? Esther, what kind of game are you playing?" "I know how it looks," she said quickly, her voice desperate. "But I didn't see it that way at the time. I told myself it was just friendly. I didn't realize." "You didn't realize?" I interrupted, laughing bitterly. "Come on, Esther. You're a lawyer. You analyze every word, every action. Don't tell me you didn't realize what you were doing." She started crying, but I couldn't find it in myself to care. "You're right," she said finally, her voice breaking. "I should have been honest with you. I should have shut it down the moment James started acting inappropriate. But I didn't. And now I've lost you." I leaned back in my chair, my arms crossed. "Did anything else happen between you two? Anything physical?" She hesitated, and my stomach dropped. "We kissed, twice," she admitted, her voice trembling. "It didn't mean anything, and I stopped it both times." "I swear." "You swear?" I repeated, shaking my head. "Your word doesn't mean much right now, Esther." "John, I made mistakes, but I never stopped loving you," she said, reaching across the table for my hand. I pulled away. "Please. You have to believe me." "I don't have to do anything," I said coldly. "You threw away everything we had for what? A few stolen moments with a guy who doesn't care about you." She flinched at my words, but I wasn't done. "I trusted you, Esther. I believed in us. And you destroyed that trust. Do you have any idea how humiliating this has been for me? To find out about all the lies, all the times people saw you with him and didn't tell me because they thought I'd already figured it out? Do you know what that feels like?" Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't say anything. Maybe she finally realized there was nothing she could say to fix this. After a long silence, I stood up and walked to the door. "We're done, Esther," I said, my voice steady. "I hope you figure out whatever it is you're looking for, but it's not with me." "John, please," she whispered, standing but making no move to follow me. "I'll do anything to make this right." "It's too late," I said, opening the door. "Goodbye, Esther." She stared at me for a moment, her face crumpling with grief. Then without another word she walked out, leaving me standing there, feeling both relieved and completely hollow. I closed the door and leaned against it, letting out a long, shaky breath. It was over. Really over. But as much as I wanted to move on, I couldn't shake the feeling that the scars from this betrayal would stay with me for a long time. The days after that final confrontation with Esther were strange. Quiet, but not peaceful. The kind of quiet that makes your thoughts louder, your memories sharper, and your emotions harder to ignore. I kept trying to convince myself I'd done the right thing, that ending it was the only way to regain some sense of control over my life. But the truth? I didn't feel in control at all. I spent most of my time at work, drowning myself in research and lectures. The university was my sanctuary, the one place where I could pretend none of this had happened. But even there, I wasn't safe. My students could tell something was off, and my colleagues kept asking if I was okay. I gave them the same answer every time: "I'm fine." I wasn't. About a week after I told Esther it was over, I ran into James at a coffee shop near campus. He was sitting with some of his colleagues, laughing like he didn't have a care in the world. I froze when I saw him, the anger bubbling up so fast it felt like I'd been punched in the gut. He must have sensed me staring because he glanced up and locked eyes with me. For a moment, his smirk faltered, but then it came back, more smug than ever. He didn't say anything. He just raised his coffee cup in a mock toast and turned back to his conversation. I wanted to walk over there and knock that stupid grin off his face. But what would that accomplish? He wasn't worth it, and I wasn't about to make a scene. So I left, my fists clenched so tightly my nails dug into my palms. Later that night, I got a call from Mark. "You okay, man?" he asked, his voice cautious. "Why wouldn't I be?" I said, though I knew my tone was sharper than I intended. "Katie told me James was bragging about seeing you at the coffee shop," he said. "Apparently, he thinks you're still hung up on Esther." Of course, he did. That was exactly the kind of guy James was, always needing to feel like he'd won, like he was the better man. "Let him think what he wants," I said, though the thought of him spreading those lies made my blood boil. "John, don't let him get to you," Mark said. "Everyone who knows him knows he's a piece of, well, you know. He's not worth your time." I wanted to believe that, but it didn't make the humiliation any easier to swallow. It felt like everywhere I went, there was another reminder of what had happened, another person who probably knew more than they let on. Then, out of the blue, Esther texted me. "John, I'm sorry to bother you, but I need to talk. It's important. Please." I stared at the message for a long time, debating whether to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to block her and move on. But another part of me, the part that still craved closure, couldn't let it go. "What is it?" I replied, keeping my tone short. She texted back almost immediately. "Can we meet?" It's not something I can say over text. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We set a time to meet at a park near my apartment, somewhere public where I could leave if things got too emotional. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting on a bench and staring out at the frozen lake. She looked tired, older somehow, like the weight of everything had finally caught up to her. "Thanks for coming," she said as I approached. "I don't have all day," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "What's so important?" She hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her coat. "I just wanted to tell you. I'm leaving the firm," she said finally. I blinked, surprised. "What?" "I can't stay there anymore," she said, her voice trembling. "Not after everything. I put in my notice yesterday." "Did James pressure you to leave?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. "No," she said quickly. "It's my decision. I can't keep working with him, and I can't stay in that environment. It's toxic." I didn't know what to say. Part of me felt like this was another ploy for sympathy, but another part of me wondered if this was her way of trying to make things right. "So what are you going to do?" I asked. "I don't know," she admitted. I needed to tell you. I wanted you to know that I'm trying to change, to be better." I nodded slowly, though I wasn't sure what to feel. "Okay. Thanks for letting me know." She looked up at me, her eyes pleading. "Do you think there's ever a chance we could talk again? Someday?" I took a deep breath, the weight of the question pressing down on me. "I don't know, Esther. Maybe. But not now." Her face fell, but she nodded, as if she'd expected that answer. "I understand," she said softly. As I walked away, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a lingering sense of closure that I wasn't sure I deserved. Maybe this was the first step toward finally letting go. Or maybe it was just another chapter in a story I was still trying to finish. After meeting Esther, I felt lighter, but not healed. Her leaving the firm felt like a step, though it didn't erase the betrayal. I still didn't trust her, and I wasn't sure I ever would. The next week, I blocked her number. It wasn't easy, but I knew I had to move forward. Every time her name popped up on my phone, it dragged me back to that night, and I couldn't keep living like that. Mark and Katie checked in often, probably out of guilt. I kept things short with them. I wasn't angry anymore, just tired. I didn't need apologies, I needed space. Work became my focus, my escape. I started picking up extra lectures and diving into research. It helped, but the nights were still hard. Memories of Esther and James crept in, but each day, the pain felt a little less sharp. I wasn't okay yet. But for the first time, I believed I could be. About a month after cutting off contact with Esther, I received a message request on social media. It was from someone I didn't expect, James. "Hey John. I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I wanted to apologize. Can we talk? I stared at the message, torn between ignoring it and unleashing my anger. What could he possibly say that would change anything? Against my better judgment, I replied. There's nothing to say, James. Stay out of my life. His response came quickly. Fair. Just wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. I crossed lines I never should have. I hope you find peace. I didn't respond. His apology felt hollow, like a move to clear his conscience rather than genuine remorse. Blocking him felt like the only way to truly shut the door, so I did. That night, I felt an odd sense of finality. James was just a shadow now, one I was ready to leave behind. The days began to blur into a new routine. I'd wake up early, go for a run, and throw myself into work. My evenings were quieter now, books, documentaries, and sometimes just sitting with my thoughts. It wasn't exciting, but it was steady, and I needed that. I started reconnecting with old hobbies. Hiking became a favorite escape, and I even joined a local history group, where I met people who shared my interests. It felt good to focus on things that were mine, things that didn't remind me of Esther or the life we'd planned. Occasionally, thoughts of her crept in, but they weren't as overwhelming as before. She was a chapter one was learning to close, one step at a time. One Saturday, while grabbing coffee after a hike, I saw Esther. She was sitting alone by the window, staring into her cup. For a moment, I considered slipping out unnoticed, but she looked up and saw me before I could. Her eyes widened, and she gave a small wave. I hesitated, then nodded back, but I didn't approach her. Instead, I ordered my coffee and sat at a table across the room, deliberately keeping my distance. When I glanced over, she wasn't looking at me anymore. She seemed lost in thought, her expression heavy. For the first time, I didn't feel anger or pain, just a strange mix of indifference and pity. I left without saying a word, and she didn't try to stop me. As I walked out into the crisp air, I realized something. I didn't feel the weight of her presence anymore. It was freeing in a way I hadn't expected. A few weeks later, during a meeting of a local history group, I found myself chatting with a woman named Rachel. She was new to the group, vibrant and curious, with an infectious enthusiasm for old architecture. We started talking about a nearby historic site, and before I knew it, we'd spent the entire meeting deep in conversation. It felt natural, easy. No expectations, no pressure, just two people enjoying a shared passion. At the end of the night, she smiled and said, "Let me know if you ever need a partner to explore those ruins." I laughed, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in months. "I'll take you up on that." It wasn't a date, not yet. But for the first time, I felt a flicker of something new, a hint of hope that maybe, just maybe, I could open my heart again someday. Rachel and I met the following weekend to explore the ruins we talked about. The site was an old industrial complex from the late 1800s, hidden just off a winding trail outside the city. It wasn't a grand castle or a famous landmark, but to history buffs like us, it was fascinating. The weather was crisp, the kind that makes you grateful for a warm coat and good company. Rachel brought along a notebook, sketching parts of the crumbling walls while we traded facts about the industrial boom of the era. We laughed more than I expected. Her humor was quick, and she wasn't afraid to poke fun at my overly academic explanations. At one point, we found a rusted old pulley system half buried in the dirt. "This thing must weigh a ton," she said, crouching to get a closer look. "Imagine the hands that worked this, the stories they carried." Her words stuck with me. I'd always been drawn to history because it felt bigger than me, a way to connect with lives long gone. But the way she said it, with a kind of reverence, made me realize how much I'd missed having someone to share those moments with. Over the next few weeks, Rachel and I kept in touch, mostly about history group events or interesting articles we'd come across. There was no rush, no pressure. It was just easy. She was the kind of person who made you feel lighter just by being around her. One night, she invited me to a small gathering at her place. It was just a few people, some from the group and a couple of her friends. I hesitated at first, worried I wasn't ready to be around new people, but something in her invitation felt genuine, like she really wanted me there. So I went. Her apartment was cozy and filled with character, shelves packed with books, little trinkets from her travels, and a record player in the corner. The group was laid back, chatting over wine and snacks while an old jazz record played in the background. Rachel moved effortlessly between conversations, making everyone feel welcome. At one point, I caught her watching me from across the room. She smiled, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I smiled back without hesitation. It was a simple moment, but it felt important, like a crack of light breaking through a long-closed curtain. As the weeks passed, our friendship deepened. We started meeting for coffee after group events, sometimes lingering for hours, talking about everything from history to music to life. Rachel had this way of asking questions that made you want to open up. She didn't pry, but she listened in a way that felt safe. One evening, as we walked back from a meeting, she asked, "Do you think people can truly start over?" The question caught me off guard. I thought about Esther, about everything I'd been through, and then about the slow but steady progress I'd made since then. "I think it's possible," I said carefully. "But it's not easy. You have to let go of a lot, expectations, anger, even parts of yourself." She nodded thoughtfully, her hands tucked into her coat pockets. "Letting go is the hardest part, isn't it?" "Yeah," I said, glancing at her. "But sometimes you find something or someone that makes it worth trying." She didn't say anything, but the look she gave me felt like an unspoken agreement, a shared understanding of how complicated and messy starting over could be. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself thinking about Rachel more than I had before. It wasn't just about her kindness or her love of history, it was the way she made me feel like I was still capable of something good, something real. For the first time in months, I felt a little hopeful about what the future might hold. Maybe starting over wasn't just possible, it was already happening. Just as things with Rachel were starting to feel promising, a reminder of my past showed up in the most unexpected way. I was leaving a lecture one afternoon when I saw Esther standing outside the building. She looked different, less polished, more subdued. She was holding a book, shifting it nervously in her hands as if it were a shield. For a moment, I considered walking right past her, pretending I didn't see her. But the part of me that hated unfinished business stopped. "John," she said, her voice hesitant. "Hi." "Esther," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "What are you doing here?" "I know I don't have the right to show up like this," she said quickly, her words tumbling out. "But I've been thinking about everything, and I just needed to say I'm sorry. Again. For all of it." I crossed my arms, unsure of where this was going. "You've already apologized." "I know," she said, glancing down. "But I don't think I've ever really told you how much I regret everything I did. Not just the betrayal, but the lies, the way I hurt you. I ruined something good, and I live with that every day." Her words were raw, and for the first time, they felt genuine. There was no defensiveness, no attempt to shift the blame. She just stood there, vulnerable and honest. "I've moved on, Esther," I said softly. "I don't hate you anymore, but I can't go back to who I was before all this. I've changed." "I know," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "And I'm glad you're moving forward. You deserve to be happy." There was a long silence, and for a moment, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't realized I still needed. "I hope you find peace too," I said finally. She nodded, a faint bittersweet smile crossing her lips. "Thank you, John. I wish you the best." And just like that, she walked away. This time, it didn't feel like an open wound. It felt like the end of a chapter one was finally ready to close. That night, I texted Rachel. "Hey, want to grab coffee this weekend? My treat." Her reply came almost instantly. "Only if you promise to let me pick the spot. See you Saturday." As I put my phone down, I realized something. The past no longer felt like a weight on my shoulders. It was just that, the past. And for the first time, the future felt wide open. The first time Rachel and I went hiking together, it was my suggestion. I chose a trail that had always been special to me, one I used to visit when I needed to clear my head or think about life. The irony wasn't lost on me. This place that had once been my retreat during hard times was now the backdrop for something entirely new. Rachel showed up in bright, mismatched hiking gear, carrying a small backpack and wearing the kind of smile that made it impossible to feel heavy. "Is this one of those trails where we're going to accidentally walk into a horror movie?" she teased as we set off. "If it is, at least we'll have a good story," I shot back. The trail was peaceful, with sunlight filtering through the trees and a soft breeze rustling the leaves. It was mid-morning, and the air still carried a slight chill, the kind that wakes you up and sharpens your senses. Rachel stopped often, taking in little details I might have missed: the curve of a tree branch, the sound of the stream running parallel to the path. "You really love this place, don't you?" she asked as we climbed a small hill. "I do," I admitted. "It's been my go-to spot for years." I used to come here when I needed to think, or when I didn't want to think. She nodded, understanding without prying. That was one of the things I appreciated most about Rachel. She had a way of inviting conversation without forcing it, giving me room to share at my own pace. As the trail wound higher, the conversation drifted to lighter topics. Her disastrous attempt at gardening. I killed a cactus. A cactus, John, my irrational fear of birds. They're too smart. I don't trust them, and our mutual love for historical ruins. She laughed easily, her joy infectious, and for the first time in months, I found myself laughing too, real laughter, the kind that comes from your gut. But as the climb steepened and the conversation quieted, my thoughts began to wander. Memories of this trail, of who I used to be when I walked it, crept in. I thought about the times I'd come here after fights with Esther, trying to sort through my feelings and convince myself that everything would be okay. I remembered how this place had once been my refuge, a place to escape the weight of disappointment and regret. Now, it felt different. It wasn't just a place to reflect, it was a place to grow. And walking it with Rachel, someone who made me feel lighter and more like myself, was a reminder of how far I'd come. When we reached the summit, the view was breathtaking. The valley stretched out below us, dotted with patches of green and gold from the changing leaves. The stream we'd followed was now just a thin, glittering ribbon winding through the landscape. Rachel let out a low whistle. Wow. This is incredible. It's why I keep coming back, I said, leaning on a nearby boulder. She pulled out her phone to take a picture, but then hesitated, lowering it. Actually, I think I'd rather just enjoy it, she said, smiling at me. Some things are better left as memories. I nodded, appreciating the sentiment. We stood there in silence for a while, just taking it in. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint smell of pine and earth. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. On the way back down, Rachel broke the quiet. You seem different here, she said. Lighter. Like you're not carrying as much. Maybe I'm not, I said, surprising myself with the honesty. This place has always helped me let go of things. Letting go is hard, she said, her tone thoughtful. But sometimes, it's the only way to move forward. She didn't push for details, but I felt the pull to share anyway. I used to come here when I was with Esther, I admitted. Whenever things got complicated, I'd walk this trail, trying to figure out if I was doing enough, if I was enough. And after everything fell apart, I avoided it for a while. Coming back now feels like reclaiming it. Rachel stopped walking and turned to me, her gaze steady. You are enough, John. You always were. It just took the wrong person to make you doubt it. Her words hit harder than I expected. I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded. But deep down, something in me shifted. She wasn't just saying what she thought I wanted to hear, she believed it, and for the first time in a long time, I started to believe it too. As we reached the end of the trail, Rachel glanced at me with a playful smile. So, is this the part where you invite me to another historic site and test my knowledge? Only if you promise not to outshine me this time, I joked. No promises, she said, laughing. We parted ways at the trailhead, but the warmth of the day stayed with me long after she was gone. Walking back to my car, I realized something. For the first time since Esther, I wasn't just moving forward, I was building something new. And this time, it wasn't about fixing the past. It was about creating a future that felt entirely my own. It had been months since the night everything fell apart with Esther. Months of questioning, grieving, and rebuilding. And now, I stood in my apartment, staring at the reflection in my bathroom mirror. I didn't look different, not really, but I felt different. Lighter. Stronger. More like myself. Today wasn't just another day. It was the day I decided to take the first real step toward something new. Rachel and I had plans for the afternoon, a visit to a museum she'd been raving about since we first met. She called it a hidden gem, tucked away on the outskirts of the city. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew I didn't care about the destination as much as I cared about the company. When I pulled up outside her apartment, she was already waiting on the curb, bundled up in a coat and scarf, her breath visible in the crisp winter air. She climbed into the car, her cheeks pink from the cold, and greeted me with a bright smile. You're early, she teased, buckling her seatbelt. Big day, I replied with a grin. Wouldn't want to miss it. The drive to the museum was full of easy conversation and laughter. Rachel had a way of filling silences without forcing them, letting things flow naturally. She told me about a lecture she was preparing for the history group, and I shared a funny story about a student who'd mistakenly referred to Napoleon as that short British guy. The museum was smaller than I'd expected, but packed with charm. Its exhibits focused on local history, artifacts from the area's founding days, old photographs, and personal accounts from people who'd lived through major events. It wasn't grand or flashy, but it was real, intimate. Rachel was in her element, wandering from display to display with wide-eyed enthusiasm. At one point, she stopped in front of an old journal encased in glass. "Look at this," she said, pointing. "A woman from the 1800s writing about her life during the gold rush. Can you imagine how much courage it took for her to leave everything behind?" Her excitement was infectious. I found myself leaning closer, drawn in by the wonder she saw in every detail. "I think you missed your calling as a museum curator," I said, half joking. She laughed, shaking her head. "I just love stories. They're how we connect, you know? Even across time. They remind us that we're not so different from the people who came before us." Her words stayed with me as we moved through the exhibits. I'd spent years studying history, but I'd never thought of it the way she did, as a bridge between people, a way to find meaning in shared experiences. It made me think about my own story, the parts I'd been trying to bury. Maybe they weren't just mistakes to forget. Maybe they were lessons that had shaped who I was becoming. After the museum, we walked to a nearby cafe for lunch. The place was small and bustling, with the smell of fresh bread and coffee filling the air. We grabbed a table by the window, and as we waited for our food, Rachel leaned forward, resting her chin in her hand. "You seem different today," she said, studying me. "Different how?" I asked, curious. "Lighter," she said with a smile. "Like you're not carrying as much anymore." I thought about her words, about everything that had led to this moment. The heartbreak, the anger, the endless nights of questioning what I'd done wrong. "I think I'm finally letting go," I said. "Not just of Esther, but of the version of myself that thought I needed someone else to feel whole." Rachel didn't say anything right away. She just reached across the table and placed her hand over mine, her touch warm and steady. "You've come a long way, John. You should be proud of that." Her words hit me in a way I didn't expect. I realized I was proud, not just of surviving the pain, but of finding the courage to start again. As we finished our meal, Rachel glanced at her watch and sighed. "I guess it's getting late. Should we head back?" "Or," I said, feeling bold, "we could take a detour. There's a spot I think you'd love." She raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "A detour, huh? Lead the way, Professor Watson." The spot I had in mind wasn't far, a quiet overlook I used to visit during my solo hikes. When we got there, the view was even better than I remembered. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the city lights were just starting to twinkle in the distance. Rachel stood at the edge of the overlook, her hands in her pockets, her breath visible in the cool air. "This is incredible," she said softly. "I thought you'd like it," I replied, standing beside her. We stood there in silence for a while, just taking it in. Finally, Rachel turned to me, her expression serious but kind. "John, I don't know where this is going," she said. "But I just want you to know. I'm glad I met you. You make me feel like anything is possible." Her words caught me off guard, but in the best way. "I feel the same," I said. "And for what it's worth, I don't know where this is going either. But I'm not scared of not knowing anymore." She smiled, her eyes meeting mine, and for the first time, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. As we drove back, the quiet between us wasn't awkward. It was comfortable, filled with unspoken possibilities. I dropped her off at her apartment, and as she stepped out of the car, she paused. "Thanks for today, John," she said. "It was perfect." "It's just the beginning," I replied, smiling. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in months. My story wasn't finished, far from it. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. I wasn't stuck in the past, and I wasn't searching for someone to fix me. Rachel was right. The best stories, the ones worth telling, were the ones we built together. And I was ready to start writing mine.